October 1014. In a small fortified hall at Prilep in the Western Balkans, an old king sits up from his sickbed, because the sound in his courtyard is not a sound he recognizes. It is a continuous, even, shuffling rhythm, as if one very long animal were dragging itself across the cobblestones. The animal is 15,000 of his own soldiers. They have been blinded with hot iron in columns of 99 men with a single, half-blind guide at the head of each, and ordered to walk home as a single, moving piece of evidence. The king's name is Samuel. He is 65, perhaps 70. The Greek chroniclers do not agree, and he has already outlived 2 generations of his enemies. The Bulgarians have called him Tsar for 20 years. He has not lost a single set-piece engagement since the day he took the throne. He sends his son out to look. Gavril Radomir goes down the wooden stairs, draws back the iron bolt of the courtyard gate, and the Chronicle of John Skylitzes, written generations later in Constantinople by a man who never saw the Bulgarian frontier, describes what he saw. Although Skylitzes was not standing in that courtyard and could not have known the smell of it. A column of men, 99 of them with both eye sockets cauterized, 100 at the front, half blind, with one eye left. Each man's hands on the shoulders of the man in front of him. They had walked from the pass at Kleidion in the Belasitsa Mountains, more than 100 miles to the south. It had taken them perhaps 8 weeks on the road. The flies had eaten what the soldering iron had not. Some of them still wore the leather harness straps they had been captured in. They did not say anything. They had been blinded for the act of being captured alive, and they had been sent home as a single piece of moving evidence. Behind that column came another column. Behind that one, another. By the time the Imperial Roman cavalry, returning from Kleidion, had finished depositing them in front of Samuel's hall at Prilep, the count, according to Skylitzes, was 15,000 men. The emperor who had ordered it was Basil II, called Porphyrogenetos, the Purple-born, of Constantinople. He was 56. He had been emperor in name since the age of 2, and in fact, since the age of 31. He had been at war with Samuel's Bulgaria for the entire reign of his adulthood. He had never married. He kept no mistress. He ate from the same field rations as his soldiers. He had spent the last 14 years annexing Bulgaria, 1 province per summer, with the methodical patience of a man closing a door behind him, room by room, hand on the latch each time. This is the story of how a Roman emperor of the Macedonian dynasty, broken 30 years earlier in these same Balkan mountains, took 30 years to walk back into them and erase a nation. It is also the story of one specific Greek number, 15,000, blinded in columns of 99, and the smaller, sharper question of whether that number is real, or whether it is the kind of number a later chronicler reaches for when he cannot reach for the cup. I want to be careful with the cup. The Synopsis Historiarum of John Skylitzes, composed in the late 11th century in Constantinople, is our primary source for the 15,000 and for the one-eyed guide at the head of each column. Skylitzes is not a friendly witness exactly. He writes under a later dynasty that had reasons to remember the old Macedonian emperors as monsters. But he is not a hostile one either. He has access to court archives that have not survived, where Yahya of Antioch, the Christian Arab chronicler born in Fatimid Egypt, who later fled to Byzantine Antioch and wrote his annals there, and who is normally the more careful witness on dates and on the Eastern view of these wars, mentions the blinding without the number, Skylitzes commits to 15,000. The earlier sources do not contradict it. They simply do not supply the figure. The epithet that would later turn Basil into a kind of national myth, Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar slayer, does not appear in any source written during his lifetime.
Kekaumenos,
The Byzantine general who composed his Strategikon a generation after Basil's death, and who knew old officers who had served the emperor in the field, calls him simply quote, _0, quote, _. The name quote, _1, quote, _ first surfaces almost a century after Kleidion under the Komnenoi and the Angeloi, at a court that needed a hero on a coin. I want to come back to that. I read the relevant passage in Skilitz's 3 times before I noticed what he isn't saying, and the omission, which I will get to before the end, is more revealing than what he chose to say. For now, there is something else worth looking at. In the report, Gavril Radomir is carrying back to his father the dispatch of a defeated Bulgarian commander to a dying king. There is a single line of geography that decided the war. A goat path through the heights of the Belasitsa range, around the wooden palisade that the Bulgarian engineers had spent 6 weeks raising across the Klidion Pass. A path that local shepherds knew, that the Bulgarian command had not bothered to garrison, that a Byzantine strategos in his early 40s, named Nikephoros Xiphias, had asked the right peasant about, in the right dialect, and been shown the way up. The whole battle, in the end, hinged on one conversation with one man whose name the Chronicle does not preserve. If the kind of work this channel does, long campaigns reduced to single passes reduced to single peasants nameless in the Chronicle, is the reason you are here, this is the work. There is more of it waiting. Now back to Prilep, and to the man on the sickbed. He read the report. According to Skylitzes, who is precise about the date in a way that makes me trust him on this specific point, he did not speak. He did not call for his physician. He laid the parchment on the table and stared past the door at the second column that was already beginning to come through the gate. He died 2 days later, on the 6th of October, 1014. The court physician called it a stroke. The chronicler called it a broken heart. A modern cardiologist would probably split the difference. He was, depending on which line of the Comatopuli pedigree you accept, either 70 or 63. The Bulgarian state he had spent his life building did not outlive him by 4 years. To understand how a Roman emperor of the Macedonian dynasty could do this to 15,000 men in a single August week, and why not one chronicler in the surviving Greek tradition, friendly to him or otherwise, ever criticized him for doing it, you have to understand what those men's grandfathers had done to him 3 decades earlier in another mountain pass to the north. Basil II did not become Bulgaroktonos by accident. He became Bulgaroktonos because in the late summer of 986, in a place called Trajan's Gate, with the imperial baggage train looted and the regalia of the empire scattered in the dust of the Sredna Gora, he had been the one running. To understand what happened at Kleidion in the summer of 1014, you have to walk back into that earlier pass with him. Basil II had been emperor of the Romans since the December he was 2 years old. He had not been emperor in any sense that mattered for the first 29 years of his life. The empire was ruled in turn by his mother's husbands and his mother's lovers. His mother was Theophano, the daughter of a Constantinopolitan tavern keeper who had married his father Romanos II at the age of about 16. By 21, she had been widowed, perhaps by her own hand, the rumor does not leave the Greek chronicles, although Skylitzes is careful with his verbs around her. She had then married the soldier emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, the conqueror of Crete and Antioch, a man twice her age who slept in a hair shirt on a stone floor and refused to enter her bed. 6 years later, in December 969, she had let her current lover into the imperial bedchamber through a balcony, and Nikephoros had been hacked to pieces beside his bed by a small group of armed nobles, whose leader, John Tzimiskes, then put on the murdered emperor's purple boots and married Theophano himself. The patriarch refused Tzimiskes' communion until he had exiled Theophano to a monastery on the Prince's Islands and publicly named the murderers, a number of whom died of unexplained accidents within the year. The boy Basil and his younger brother Constantine sat through it. They went to the palace school of grammar and Greek rhetoric. They were paraded at ceremonies in stiff little dalmatics. They learned, by watching, the only lesson the dynasty had to teach them. Power was about being the last one in the room. In January 976, John Tzimiskes died of typhus, or possibly of slow poison, depending on which chronicle one trusts and which palace eunuch one is in the habit of believing. Basil was 18. The empire passed, finally, into his own hands and his brothers. Or it would have, if the great Anatolian magnate Bardas Skleros had not refused to obey the new emperor, raised the eastern field armies in revolt, and within 2 years brought rebel forces within sight of Constantinople. The young emperor needed a soldier. He gave the supreme command to Bardas Phocas, a nephew of the murdered Nikephoros. Phocas defeated Skleros in single combat in 979, drove him into Iraqi exile, and returned to court a man too dangerous to leave alive and too useful to kill. Basil filed the lesson and waited. In the late summer of 986, at the age of 28, Basil decided to make himself an emperor in his own right by doing what his father and his uncle had failed to do. He marched on Bulgaria. The Bulgarian state of 986 was not yet Samuel's state. It was the broken remainder of the empire that John Tzimiskes had crushed 13 years earlier, and from which Tzimiskes had paraded Tsar Boris II through the streets of Constantinople in the captured Bulgarian regalia, stripped him of it in the Forum, and demoted him to a Roman court rank. The Macedonian conquest of the late 960s and early 970s had cracked the old First Bulgarian Empire into pieces. But in the Western Highlands, in the country between the Lake of Ohrid and the Lake of Prespa, 4 brothers had begun to rebuild. The chroniclers call them the Cometopuli, the sons of the Count. Their father was a comes named Nicholas, a Bulgarian provincial governor of a kind the Greeks did not fully understand. The eldest brother was David, then Moses, then Aaron. The youngest was Samuel. By 986, 3 of the brothers were already dead, and Samuel was alone. David had been killed by Vlach shepherds on the road between Castoria and Prespa. Moses had died in a botched assault on the walls of Sers. Aaron, and this is the line Skylitzes hesitates over, had been killed by Samuel himself on a day in the late 970s or the late 980s. The chronology is disputed even among Skylitzes' manuscripts, in front of his entire family. The Chronicle gives the verb, but not the cause. The standard reconstruction is that Aaron had been negotiating with Constantinople. Whether that is true, or whether Skylitzes is supplying a motive he could not have known, the practical effect was the same. From the late 980s, Samuil ruled western Bulgaria alone. He was, depending on which set of Greek dates one trusts, about a decade younger than Basil, or possibly the same age. The Greek sources do not agree, and the Bulgarian sources do not survive. What we can say is that he was at the height of his energy in 986, and that he was waiting in the mountain pass of Trajan's Gate in the Srednagora range south of modern Sofia, when the young emperor of the Romans marched up into the wooded ridges with the slow imperial baggage train of a campaign that had been planned as a triumph from the first day. The story of what happened there in mid-August 986 is told by Leo the Deacon, who is one of our better witnesses for the Macedonian campaigns, and who was, by his own admission, present in the imperial column. Leo describes the road. He describes the wagons of the baggage train, heavy, slow, loaded with the relics and regalia of a campaign that had been intended to end in coronation, not survival. He describes the Bulgarian ambush from the wooded ridges above the pass, the cutting off of the rear of the column, the slow strangling of the Roman vanguard. He describes the emperor, 28 years old, escaping with what remained of his Armenian infantry and a single squadron of tagmatic cavalry. He describes the loss of the imperial parasol, the imperial standards, and most of the personal regalia. He does not describe the imperial crown being captured. Later, Bulgarian traditions claim it was, and Samuil's son would in 1018 surrender a crown to Basil at Ohrid, that some historians suspect was the one taken at Trajan's Gate. I lean toward the suspicion, but Leo does not say. Leo, writing within a year or two of the event, gives the Roman casualties at almost the whole of the imperial army. He does not give a number. Yahya of Antioch, working from caliphate sources, says 4,000 foot and an uncounted body of cavalry. I find Yahya's number more credible. Leo had reasons to inflate the disaster, but 4,000 is still a tenth of the field army of a generation, and the loss of the regalia mattered more than the bodies. For a Roman emperor of 28 to lose, on his first independent campaign, the emblems of his throne to a barbarian chieftain in his own mountains was a kind of public castration. He could not return to Constantinople without the regalia. He had the regalia remade quickly. It did not fool anyone in the room. The man who came back from Trajan's Gate was not the same man who had marched out. Michael Psellos, writing his Chronographia in the next century, describes the transformation in a passage I have read many times and still cannot read without recognizing the cadence of someone who has seen a friend after a private disaster. From this point on, Psellos says, Basil became a different man. He gave up the softness of his life. He drank watered wine. He slept in the field with his soldiers. He stopped laughing in public. Psellos is sometimes a perfumed sauce. I trust him here. Basil also did something colder, and it was the colder thing that mattered. In 987, Bardas Phocas, the same general he had been forced to lean on at the beginning of his reign, declared himself emperor. The eastern field armies followed Phocas. Within months, Phocas controlled most of Anatolia and was massing for an assault on Constantinople. Basil sent emissaries north, past the new ruler of Kiev, the Prince Vladimir, who had just converted to Roman Christianity and married Basil's own sister, Anna. Vladimir sent him 6,000 of the long-handled axemen, later known as the Varangian Guard. With those axes, Basil broke Phocas in person at the Battle of Abydos in April 989. Phocas suffered some kind of seizure in the saddle as he charged the imperial line and died on the spot before either commander struck a blow. The eastern field armies surrendered. The magnate Bardas Skleros, who had come back out of Iraqi exile to ally with Phocas, gave himself up to Basil at the door of his own house and was permitted to die in retirement 2 years later. This is the period of Basil's life I trust least in the surviving sources. The years between the suppression of Phocas in 989 and the renewed Bulgarian campaign of 1000 are reported by Yahya of Antioch in summary, by a fragmentary act of the Patriarchate, and by what Skylitzes seems to have reconstructed from imperial inventories rather than narrative chronicles. Basil II broke the great Anatolian landowning families with a series of laws, the novellae on the powerful, which I will not litigate in this video because they are a longer story than this one. The short version is that by the year 1000, Basil II had unmade 3 magnate revolts, 3 rivals to the imperial throne, and the personal landed wealth of perhaps 200 senatorial families. He had also become, by Yahya's count, the most actively campaigning Roman emperor since Trajan. In 1000, he turned south against Samuil again, and here the pattern of the war becomes the war. He did not invade, he chewed. Annual summer campaigns into a different Bulgarian region each year, sieges of single fortresses, bribery of single Bulgarian chieftains, resettlement of whole populations. Slavic farmers moved into Roman Anatolia, Armenian smallholders moved into the new Bulgarian emptied valleys. He did not seek a decisive engagement, and Samuil could not refuse him one without ceding ground every summer. Skopje fell in 1004. The Vidin fortress fell in 1003 after an 8-month siege. The Strymon Valley was steadily closed off. By 1010, Samuil controlled only the western highlands, the country around Ohrid and Prespa, and the mountain barriers between them and the Aegean coast. It was during this period, somewhere in the years 1004 to 1011, the Chronicle does not pin the date, that an Anatolian officer of Armenian descent named Nikephoros Xiphias was promoted to the strategos of Philippoupolis. Philippoupolis is the modern Plovdiv. It was the largest Roman city in the Central Balkans and the operational base for every campaign Basil II ran into the Bulgarian interior. Xiphias was in his late 30s when he took the post. He came from a minor military family. His father had served under the elder Phocas, and he spoke at least the trade Greek used by Bulgarian Slavs on the frontier. He knew shepherds. He knew the country. He had a particular reputation, attested in passing by Skylitzes, for talking to local guides before he committed troops. The Chronicle does not, I think, single him out at this stage because the Chronicle did not yet know what he was about to do. By the spring of 1014, 14 years of patient strangulation had narrowed the Bulgarian state to a single defensible corridor. The Strymon ran north from the Aegean, and at the southern end of the bend, where the river turned west into the mountains of the Belasitsa, lay the pass of Kleidion. Kleidion is a Greek word. It means the key. Through that key passed every road between Roman Macedonia and the Bulgarian heartland at Ohrid. If Basil crossed Kleidion in the summer of 1014, the war was finished. Samuil decided the war was not finished. Through the late spring and the early summer, he raised every man he could put in the field. The chroniclers give the figure of 15,000, although the number for the entire Bulgarian field army of 1014 is the same number Skylitzes will later give for the blinded captives. and I do not entirely trust the coincidence. He set Bulgarian engineers to build a palisade across the pass at Kleidion, felled trees lashed together with rawhide into a wall 10 or 12 feet high, ditches dug behind it, infantry stacked on the forward slope. He had used the same defensive tactic against the Greeks for 30 years, and it had worked every time. The Greeks would walk into the pass. The Greeks would batter at the palisade. The Greeks would lose enough men in the first 2 days to retreat by the third. Samuel had won this engagement before. He believed he was going to win it again. In late July, 1014, the Imperial Roman army crossed the Strymon and entered the Belositsa Mountains from the south. At the head of the column rode the emperor, 56 years old, in a heavy lamella coat, too warm for the season, eating dried river fish from the same canvas bag as his junior officers. Behind him in the second column rode the strategos of Philippopolis. Nikephoros Siphias had been told to ride ahead with a small force, examine the pass, and report. The Chronicle of Skylitzes does not preserve what they said to each other before Siphias rode out. It only preserves what Siphias did when he reached the pass and saw the wall. He did not order an assault. He spent 2 days riding the southern face of the Belositsa with a single Bulgarian shepherd, whose name the Chronicle never gives. Then he came back and told the emperor that he had found a way around. On the night of July 28, 1014, in the dark, while the Bulgarian sentries on the palisade across the Klidion Pass were watching the imperial campfires below them and counting cookfires for the imperial breakfast, Nikephoros Siphias led roughly 2,000 soldiers up the southern face of the Belositsa range, along a single goat track. The shepherd had taken him over the same path twice during the previous 2 days, walking it. The Bulgarian engineers had assumed that the slopes above the pass were too steep for armed men. They were correct about armed men carrying full equipment in column. They were wrong about armed men carrying half their equipment in their hands and the other half on their backs. The Greeks reached the ridge above the Bulgarian camp before first light. The Chronicle of Skylitzes does not specify what Siphias said to them when they reached the top. It only says that the strategos, quote, The trumpets sounded on the morning of July 29th. For 2 days before that morning, the imperial legions had been throwing themselves against the palisade in the conventional way. They had built crude scaling ladders out of the same timber the Bulgarians had used for the wall. They had taken arrow fire from the slope above and lost men. By the second evening, the Bulgarians on the wall had begun to grow confident in the rhythm of it. This was the Greek attack they had seen and broken for 30 years. The third day would be the day the Greeks pulled back to count their dead. Instead, on the morning of the third day, the camp behind the palisade was already burning. What happened in the Bulgarian camp at Kleidion, when Siphias struck the rear, is one of the few episodes in Skylitzes where the Chronicle's normal prose breaks down. He uses the word panic 3 times in 2 sentences. The defenders on the palisade, facing forward, facing the imperial assault that had been coming at them for 2 days, turned to see their own tents on fire behind them, their own commanders dead in their bedrolls, and the imperial tagmata pouring down the slope at their backs in a controlled walking advance with shields locked. They did not have a second line of palisade. They had not been expecting to need one. They broke. Skylitzes describes the rout briefly and without polish. The Bulgarians, fleeing back into their own palisade, were piled against it. Some were killed by the press of bodies, others fell into the trenches they had dug behind the wall. Others were taken alive in large number. Yahya of Antioch, working from different sources entirely, gives the same broad outline without the detail of the palisade pile-up. The taken alive part is the number that matters. The standard figure given by Skylitzers is 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers captured alive in a single day. Catherine Holmes, who has gone over the surviving manuscripts of Skylitzes more carefully than anyone since Becker, notes that this is the largest single-day capture figure in any Byzantine chronicle for any campaign of the 11th century. The figure is suspiciously round. Yahya does not contradict it. He simply does not provide his own. Samuel himself, who was at Strumica, 30 miles to the north when the news arrived, escaped capture only because his own son, Gavril Radomir, who had been in the Kleidion sector with a small reserve cavalry force, rode through the route and pulled his father onto a remount. The Greek Chronicle gives the detail dryly. Samuel was nearly taken. His son brought him a fresh horse. It does not say, although I think it ought to be said, that Gavril Radomir saved his father's life for the second time that summer. Now we come to the part of the story that the Chronicle reports without a flinch, and that no modern reader, in my experience, hears without one. What Basil II did with 15,000 prisoners is the line in Skylitzes that everyone remembers and that almost nobody reads in context. Quote, 7. Quote, Skylitzes writes, quote, 8. Quote, the translation is slightly literal. The Greek is precise on the ratio. 99 cauterized, 1 left with a single eye. 15,000 men, 150 columns, 150 one-eyed guides walking north into the Bulgarian heartland. The Chronicle does not specify the method. The standard reconstruction, drawing on the medical practice attested elsewhere in Skylitzes and on the legal blinding punishments preserved in the Ekloga and the Prokeros Nomos, is that the eyes were pierced with a hot iron probe and the wound seared. The men were not killed because they were not being executed. They were being sent back. The blinding took perhaps 3 weeks to accomplish on a population that size. The walk to Prilep took another 8. The Chronicle does not say what they were given to eat on the road. It does not say how many died of the wound itself before they reached the capital. It does not say how many were lost on the road and never counted. I have looked for these figures in Yahya, in Skylitzes, in Kekaumenos. They are not there. There is a long modern argument about whether any of this is true, exactly as Skylitzes tells it. Paul Stevenson, in his 2003 book on the historical career and the later mythologized reputation of Basil II, made the case that the epithet ___quote _9__ Bulgar Slayer was a 12th century invention. He traced its earliest secure attestation to authors writing during the reign of Manuel I Komnenos in the mid-11th century, more than 100 years after Basil's death, and argued that the legend of the columns of 99 had hardened into its present shape during that later century, when Constantinople needed a national hero against a re-emerging Bulgarian state. Stevenson did not say the blinding never happened. He said the specific number and the specific ratio were a late embellishment. Catherine Holmes, 2 years later, in her 2005 study of Basil's reign, accepted Stevenson on the epithet, but pushed back on the implication. The blinding, she pointed out, is corroborated by Yahya of Antioch, writing within 2 generations of the event and outside the Constantinopolitan tradition. The mass mutilation of prisoners as a Byzantine military practice is well attested elsewhere. Skylitzes himself records smaller incidents under Basil's father and uncle. What is uncertain is the precise figure of 15,000 and the precise ratio of 99 to 1. Both, Holmes notes, are the kind of round numbers that hagiography and propaganda alike produce. I lean toward Holmes. The blinding happened. The columns are real. The exact number is not safe to commit to in narration, and the chroniclers who give it are doing what chroniclers do, converting an unimaginable thing into a memorable thing. The point of the campaign, militarily, was not a body count. The point was demographic. Basil II removed the Bulgarian field army from the recruitment pool of the Bulgarian state in a single afternoon. The blinded men were a moving piece of public information. They told every Bulgarian village they passed through what had happened, and what would happen to anyone else taken alive on a Bulgarian battlefield against the Roman emperor. It worked. Samuil saw the first column at Prilep on the 4th of October. He had been ill for some weeks already. Skylitzes notes the illness without specifying it. He died on the 6th. His son, Gavril Radomir, was crowned Tsar of Bulgaria the same day, in the same hall, in front of the same blinded men who had reached the courtyard. The court ceremony, by all surviving accounts, was unusually short. Gavril Radomir reigned for 13 months. He had been groomed by his father, had fought at Kleidion, had pulled Samuil onto a remount during the rout. He was reportedly a capable soldier and a less capable politician.